Right, guys, welcome back to the Adam Peeler Fitness Podcast. Today on the show, I have none other than Menno Henselmans. Menno Henselmans is a very well-known figure in the fitness industry. Anybody who kind of is in the evidence-based sphere knows that Menno makes you think when he posts. I highly recommend following him on Instagram. He's always posting really cool research findings, and he really does. I think he challenges a lot of conventional wisdom that might be perceived as wisdom, and basically tries to think a little bit more critically about, what is actually efficacious for achieving kind of strength and physique goals. I believe, are you currently researching with out of FAU with Dr. Stone or Bill Campbell?
Yeah, Bill Campbell. We have a study that's currently finished, should be published not too long from now, about diet breaks. And thank you very much, by the way, for the introduction.
Yeah, of course. So I kind of just wanted to hop right into things, and I think that we'll kind of just first talk about high frequency and muscle growth, because Menno has, I think you kind of have a reputation of being a little bit more of a high frequency style of training, especially, and this is a little bit, anybody who is familiar with row splits is like a once a week training, or like push pull legs is 2 times a week. I would know that you have on your website an article that says that 5 times a week is superior to 2 times a week. So maybe you could delve a little bit more into what benefits are there of high frequency for muscle growth. What are some limitations of it, and maybe who is it for and who is it not?
Sure. That article is based on a study where they compared 2 groups that were equal in all regards in terms of sets, training intensity, tempo, exercise selection. So same program, but one group did all of the exercises for each muscle group in 2 days, and the other group basically 5 times. It varied a bit per muscle group, if I remember correctly, but some of the measured muscle groups were actually trained 5 times per week, which is a lot. So if you train 5 times a week, that's full body 5 times a week. So the 5 times a week group actually did significantly better. Most research findings have erred on the side of there not being that much difference. And I think a crucial determinant is whether you're racking up more volume in terms of repetitions or volume load. And you should be racking up more volume if you do higher frequencies. Because if you do 6 sets of squats on Tuesday normally, and you're going to split those up, you're going to do 3 sets on Monday and 3 sets on Thursday, then you should be able to do more reps, right? Because your first day workout, you're not as fatigued. And indeed, this is in practice what you basically always see. Interestingly, in research, you don't always see this. And that's partly by design, because they keep volume equated. But if you keep volume equated, you're basically telling the high frequency group to train less hard. And the whole benefit, or one of the key benefits, is that you can do more work. The quality of the work is higher and you can do more work. So a few studies have found that even if strength and size gains in many studies are similar, at least one work is equated, the quality of work is higher in terms of muscle activity, and some research is higher. You can do more reps, so volume output should be higher. And interestingly, in contrast to what you would intuitively think, or at least popular wisdom, recovery capacity by various measures is better. And there's been a study out recently where they compared even twice a day versus once a day. I think it was 10 sets of bench presses, all in the same session, or split into 2 sessions of 5 each. And despite performing more volume when splitting up the session, they recovered faster after the higher frequency protocol. And there have been numerous studies earlier that showed that the testosterone to cortisol ratio is better in individuals that train with higher frequency, even given the same other program. Like I said, some research finds higher muscle activity levels, which is probably due to lower levels of muscle damage. Because by the time, if you do like a bro split, by the time you're at exercise 5, your muscles have lots of damage, and the quality of your work is not going to be great. And that reflects in part in lower muscle activity levels. And there's also, this is mostly if you're actually going to train more, but exercising increases sleep quality. So that might be somewhat of a consideration. But I think the main ones are that you just get higher quality work, you can do more total work output and still actually recover better. Now, this means that if you're training twice a week with moderate volume, does the frequency matter? Well, twice a week maybe, but if you're doing like 3-4 times and the volume's low, like maybe 10 sets a week or less, probably it won't matter. You're going to get the same gains. But if you're pushing limits, if you're a powerlifter or competitive athlete, physique athlete, and you're pushing, maybe at least 15 plus sets per week per muscle group, which most research finds if you're in that category, advanced lifter, you probably should be, then it's likely superior. I think, at least if you measure this out in the long run, I think you will see better muscle growth and strength development. And indeed, we see that in quite some studies on Olympic weightlifters, the Norwegian Frequency Project, National Level Powerlifters. Now, like I said, in recreational, like intermediate lifters, you won't see major differences. But I think if you're pushing it to the advanced level, really pushing your recovery capacity, then I think you're going to get some additional gains by training with higher frequency. It's also good to note, by the way, that my position on this is in large part just looking at the data. Like, we have lots of studies now on training frequency. Most find no difference. And I think there are maybe six or eight, depending on if you count published or not published, that find benefits of higher frequency. And there's only one, I think Sarek et al., which finds that for 1 out of 4 measures, biceps grew better in the lower frequency, but it was kind of iffy because it didn't correspond with the other measures. So it's like, okay, let's say we do count that for 1 up for the lower frequency group, then the record is still like, I think 20, maybe 30 studies showing no effect, 8 or so in favor, or at least strong trends in favor, and 1 potentially against. So just looking at the data by that, you could say that, well, I think I want to be in the group of potentially having benefit.
Yeah, I actually have a similar experience with that, with how I changed my training in this past year, because I traditionally only did like a push-pull leg sort of a split. And then ever since I came on to my new coach and we started doing a lot more high frequency stuff, where like basically I do full body like 6 times a week.
Right.
And I found that as like for a powerlifter, just like you're kind of doing full body just every single time that you do train. And it was interesting because at first it was a little bit difficult to adapt to. And I think that's one of the hard things that, people might, if they don't do it right, but, my coach gave me like a couple of intro weeks and like we kind of ramped volume slowly up and kind of got a little bit more. But I kind of found that as I've adapted to it, I can train basically much more productively. I have much more total volume load. And I think that in powerlifting circles, you see that in particularly on the bench press, it's really common to, even see 5 times a week bench pressing programs where it's like, 3 sets, per day. And I remember when I used to look at that, I was like, how would you be able to do that? How would you be recovered? And it's kind of just the body has a lot of really, really good mechanisms in place to actually manage that through the repeated bout effect and just getting more used to it. So I've definitely noticed that I have a lot more of, I've noticed anecdotally a lot better experience also. I do know that you have cited like on the Revive Stronger podcast that I believe Steve actually posted last week. You were talking about how you train 7 days per week. And I was thinking about that because I remember I've actually went through a period where I did decide to split up more of my accessory work because I found that especially after, if I had squats and deadlifts on the same day, just after I'd just be so wrecked for my accessories.
Yes.
And so I did try, spreading out that volume a little bit more and doing more 7 days per week and, not having that rest day, which I know is unconventional, but I have found that has helped me, one, probably have a little bit, just potentially a little bit better muscle growth. Like I've been able to stay a lot leaner on this bulk than I have in other bulks, then, just because of more frequency. Because you could maybe elaborate a little bit on, rest days and, I know that you probably don't do 7 days a week for all of your clients, right? Your scheduling issues and whatnot, but in terms of determining like work to rest ratio in training, how important is it to have a rest day? Like what times would you actually say, yeah, buddy, like you need a rest day, or would you do something a little bit more like you're doing for yourself? Because I know that you probably do like 2 to 3 sets per muscle group per day when you do that sort of an approach.
Yeah, most of the time. Like during a bulk, I might go up to 4, and I've done crazy experiments with 6 and even 8 and 10.
Dang,
But
crap.
yeah, no, that was more of an experiment in
Did you go
looking what
rapid?
overtraining would be. But the main finding was that I think overtraining is not a complete myth, but it's a lot more. Most findings of overtraining are motivational or injuries. It's not like the muscles really cannot handle it. In any case, that's a bit of a tangent. For most people, I think at least the benefits of training every single day would be very slim. So I think for most of my clients, they prefer, training max 5 times a week. And then I'm not going to tell them, you should really do 7, because the benefit of going from 5 to 7, especially if you're not professional competitive level athlete, is very slim. I think you can see the benefit of training frequency in large part in line with volume. Like there is a limit to how much productive volume you can do per session. So the more volume you want to do in total, the more you benefit from spreading that out. And in large part, training frequency functions a lot like your rest intervals. If you just can't accumulate a certain amount of volume if you were resting 1 minute per set, because at some point you're just completely gassed. Like you'd be much better off spreading it to a new workout or just resting longer in between sessions. And if you think about it, if you extend the idea of a rest interval to a certain level, then you're talking about training frequency, right? Usually we think of it as rest interval when we're talking about minutes, but when we say we split it up into 2 sessions per day, we're talking about training frequency again. Although you could also say that, between my bench press and my double bench press, I take 4 hours rest. And then we call it training frequency, but we could also call it a rest interval. And it functions much the same way in the literature. Like if the volume's higher, which it should be, then it might potentially be beneficial. But volume equated, training frequency per se or the rest interval per se does not have much effect. In terms of rest to work ratio, I think you basically hit the nail on the head by that term, because that ratio is all that matters. It's about you have a certain amount of volume in the week and you want to distribute that. And whether you have a rest day or not is in itself not relevant. Like because of the Gregorian calendar, we have a lot of ideas that a week, a day, an hour, these things are like magical numbers, right? So you need a rest day, but it's not like your body has anything special going on when it has a rest day compared to if you train 7 days a week, then you still have, a 1:24 ratio of work to rest typically.
Yeah.
You train for 1 hour, you have 23 hours of rest. So especially by competitive athlete standards in team sports or gymnastics, that ratio is actually already extremely lenient because they typically train 4 hours a day more. Like any Olympic athlete, they'll train hours a day generally. So, we tend to have a pretty skewed idea of what the body really needs. And in the end, like I said, it's just about the total amount of work that you cram into, say, a certain time period. And a week is practical to use because most of our schedules revolve around weeks with work and everything. But there's nothing magical about having a rest day or same with training on certain days of the week. For example, if you train 6 days a week, then most of my clients, I tell them, take your rest day when you feel you need it the most or when life just gets in the way. Like it doesn't have to be Sunday every week, unless you plan Monday to be a certain, your PR testing day or whatever.
Yeah. I would kind of echo that because, it's just kind of more about like what you're like, obviously volume, and just figure out like what are your volume needs. Like for example, if you're a beginner, like you probably don't need to be training as frequently. I wanted to ask though, just because, we hear a lot about training day versus rest day nutrition. I think it's a lot more common in enhanced bodybuilders for some other reasons that are, unbeknownst to natties. But in terms of training to rest day calories, so let's say that you have a pretty fixed step count, either use that as a means to track your energy expenditure. It's not perfect, but it's the closest thing that we have. Would you say that there's any benefit to cycling calories on training versus rest days? Let's say that, if you're training 3 days per week versus 6 days per week, would you say that, I think that's a pretty big consideration. I have some clients who they just prefer it. They do just prefer it. I have anecdotally experimented with it. I have noticed I maybe have a little bit better insulin sensitivity, potentially. Like maybe I do dip into some fat stores, and if I am in a deficit on that day. But my question is, do you think that's majoring in the minors, or is that something that we should probably pay attention to if we do want to have the most out of our training outcomes?
I think it might be relevant. This is an area where I'm most curious about research, because we have basically no research that really looks at rest versus training day calorie cycling. And I think it makes a lot of sense to implement some form of calorie cycling. Like, we know there's an anabolic window after every workout, and that's not the anabolic peak all of 1 or 2 hours. It's the actual process of muscle growth that occurs typically 24 hours or longer. If you train 3 times a week full body, if you set up your program well, probably those workouts will have 48 hours of growth afterwards. If it's only 24 hours, then you can handle a lot more volume. You're undertrained. So basically, you want the anabolic window to last all the way until your next workout, essentially. The peak, though, will be much higher in the first part of the day, or the first part after the workout. And we have a few studies that looked at calorie distribution within the day. And they generally find that when you have more of your calories allocated to the period in between your workout and bedtime, you get better nutrient partitioning, better muscle growth to fat ratio of gain or loss. Most are own loss. So I think if we extend that concept, and again, just don't restrict ourselves to Gregorian calendar days, then it makes sense that we want more of our nutrients to be in the anabolic window. And we can take some of the nutrients on periods, like if you train 3 times a week, you have one day where you have a double rest day, especially that second rest day. I would say, well, we could go protein sparing modified fast there. Probably you're not going to build too much muscle. Even if you are, those calories would probably be better suited towards the other days. Now, is this as important as total energy intake, protein intake? No, most likely not. But I think based on the studies of within day calorie distribution, there will be an effect, especially in more trained individuals, where we know that the anabolic window is more narrow compared to an untrained individual, where it's probably going to last multiple days every time you train. And indeed, we have a study by Mori et al. From Japan that shows that nutrient timing, in this case, was more pre and post workout timing, but similar concept. It did matter in bodybuilders, but it did not matter in untrained individuals doing the same protocol. So we have some research support for that. And I think overall, if you don't do it, you're actually sort of doing reverse calorie cycle, because a lot of people think, well, if I'm bulking, I'm in energy surplus every single day, and that means every day I'm in 5% energy surplus. But actually, because your training day energy expenditure is going to be like 500 calories higher, that means that if you have a very moderate surplus across the week, a lot of that surplus is actually going to be on your rest day, because that's 500 calories extra surplus. And that means that you might actually be in a scenario where you're in energy deficit much of the week, because you're only on like if you're doing a lean bulk, you may only be in like 2% energy surplus on average. It might actually be the case that 6 days a week, you're just barely in energy deficit or surplus or energy or maintenance. And on your rest day, you have a significant energy surplus. I don't think that's going to be optimal. So to the extent that it matters, and I think it will matter, at least to some extent, you want to do at least some calorie cycling to avoid the scenario of reverse sort of calorie cycling. When you probably want more energy surplus on your training days versus your rest days. And if you're having a constant daily energy intake across the week and a significant training energy expenditure, many people actually end up with the reverse, where they have more surplus or less deficit on the rest days and more deficit or less surplus on their training days.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially with what you did point out about basically the role of meal frequency and then timing around your training. Because I do always tell all my clients, like the number one thing that matters is like your peri-workout and nutrition is like pre and post, because you don't have the substrates for hard training, and then that recovery, after. And I've anecdotally experienced that. Just going off of that, like I used to, like back, especially when I was back in school, I would get busy I would kind of pay a lot less attention to like meal timing. And I would be like the 2 meal per day person, and like maybe like have like a protein shake or whatever. And I think I did lose out on some gains, and like my conditioning was worse. And I can actually echo that in terms of the rest day to training day thing. I do think that it does depend a lot on how much volume that you probably do on each one of your training days. And then lots of times on rest days, like if you are taking a rest day, you're probably going out of your way to rest, and probably you're going to have a little bit lower energy expenditure. So I guess my main takeaway from that is we don't have a ton of data, but based off of your experience and what you have observed with people that you have worked with, and it might make sense just to make sure that you are you're pulling it back on rest days, especially if you're not like extra active. Like for myself personally, like I have no chill with lifting, and like I'll just do extra cardio, or like I'll just walk around a little bit more, do something like that. So it maybe is a little bit of a difference, but like I said, like with my coach, we just do higher fats and lower carbs, and that's one way that we kind of do it. So maybe cycling like the fuel sources a little bit, and that does kind of help out a little bit. And now going off of that, so just talking about meals per day and the role of meal frequency in one. I think number one, adherence is what we should talk about first, and then secondarily being, let's say you want to maximize in both scenarios, either fat loss or muscle growth. How important is nutrient timing, or meal frequency, and what would you recommend to people who are trying to either cut or bulk in terms of both adherence and secondarily overall outcomes? Just to preface this, how I view meal frequency is I will generally say if you have a larger calorie intake, you probably eat more meals per day, and if you're on lower calories, probably a little bit less. But I want to see like what your take is on that. So
I think that's a practical recommendation. Most research finds that where you don't have a lot of research on adherence specifically, but we do have a lot of research on appetite. And appetite management is generally best, meaning you're most easily satiated, on 3 to 4 meals a day. If you go up much higher, then the problem is what many people, I think, intuitively experience: the meals just become too small. Like you're never full. And you do want to be at least reasonably full a few times a day. And if you go really low, then that's probably suboptimal for nutrient timing. And it's also, you have very big gaps. Some individuals, I'm also actually one of those, will naturally gravitate somewhat towards maybe 2 meals a day. But I've also found for myself, at least a trend towards better results, especially for when bulking, on 3 meals or even 4 versus 2. And research on this is generally doesn't show big effects, if any, on meal frequency. But I think 2 is not enough. We have the Iowa Boxer study showing that at least when you have like all protein shakes and liquid meals, then 6 was better than 3. But I think that won't apply. And it's a similar study by R. Sierra. But most studies that use solid foods, they find no effects when you go over 3, including the Norwegian Meal Frequency Project, where they actually found better results for 3 versus 6. I don't think that makes any sense. So, but it's at least strong evidence that 6 was not better than 3. And we have a meta-analysis on protein feeding in between meals versus across meals. And if we assume most people probably have 3 meals, or at least a lot of people are going to have 3 meals, and they found no effects of whether you add it to the meals or in between meals. So indirectly, that also suggests probably 3 meals is enough. And we have a study pretty recent, or about a year ago, which found that 2 meals or 3 meals, when one of them was really small, so it didn't hit the leucine threshold, did not result in optimal results versus spreading the protein out more equally across the 3 meals, which also strongly indicates 2 is not enough. I think for 3 meals is possible to do optimally, but then you do need to look at where those meals are in relation to the workout. You don't want to, for example, work out in the morning and then start eating at lunchtime. In general, fasted training, I think, is a big no-go. We actually have a study on that in the works, but COVID put a serious wrench in that, so it's going to be a long time, probably this year somewhat, we can finish the last cohort, and then next year probably before it's published. But it's going to be the first study that actually directly looks at this, like mTOR and anabolic signaling with fasted versus fat training, and then also a long-term trial to just see if it's actually suboptimal. But we have a lot of data at least suggesting it's suboptimal to train fasted. So I think that generally summarizes. As long as you're not training fasted, you are sandwiching your workout reasonably well with meals, then you want at least 3 meals a day, and you can go higher. When cutting, if you don't have a lot of energy, it's going to be tough probably if you go really high, like 6+, and you're better off with 3 or 4 meals. They just can be a lot bigger. And when you're bulking, you might actually want to take advantage of that and go to 6 meals or so, because otherwise you just can't get all the food in. Like at some point, I have to bulk on 4,500 calories, and in 3 meals, that's pretty tough, because I keep it super clean. Would be no issue if I ate ice cream and stuff, but with all like whole foods, then 3 meals, they're big ass meals.
Yeah, I mean, so I actually have that same issue. Is like but I have a pretty adaptive metabolism when I'm
luxury problem.
Yeah, like I don't really adapt downward super fast. But that's also because I don't really ever get too much above like 12% body fat. So like it's kind of like I go on like 3,000 calories and like just do that for like a couple of weeks and I lose any fat. But I've had an issue with just going on to that high of calorie intake, especially with clean foods, like having like, with like fiber. And sometimes like I get some more like digestive problems with like my gastrointestinal tract. And I guess my question with that is, are there any like recommendations for people who have a real large energy intake to maybe have a little bit more stable, like a better like digestion, maybe not have, because like, for example, like sometimes it messes up, especially the tracking problem is if you use like the scale. And obviously I only do take like averages, but it can be kind of like a mind, like what the heck is happening? When you know that you have a GI issue, but it's like, oh my gosh, like tracking weights, and it's like you're outpacing your rate of gain. So is there any things that you do or you recommend to your clients who are maybe experiencing that? I know FODMAPs are probably one of them, but
Yes.
sometimes as you know, going like that high in calories, you kind of have to stack up on fiber. So how would you handle, like, I guess, because I don't really see it that much with people that have lower calorie intakes, like they just don't really seem to have as much. But then like big dudes who like have to eat, is it you're 93 kilos or something like that, 95? Yeah, so you're big, so you get it. So I guess would you be able to elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, I think for your digestion, meal frequency, macros, all these things are definitely secondary to food choices. We do have quite some research showing that consistency helps. So just having a consistent meal frequency, eating at consistent times of day, those things aid your digestion. Eating consistent food choices, because you also can get used to foods. For example, gluten, your body can actually upregulate the amount of gluten it can process, even if you're somewhat gluten intolerant. Same with lactose. If you're lactose intolerant, you can sort of become more lactose tolerant by consuming more dairy. So that helps. But mostly indeed, it's FODMAPs and seeing what kind of foods you tolerate well and which you don't. Now, for a lot of people, the issue is not consuming enough fiber to begin with. So you just need more fiber, sometimes also more magnesium. But when you do have a reasonably good diet, it's likely, especially with constipation, gas, those kind of things, those are often FODMAP related. And in particular, it's almost exclusively plant foods that have these problems in a lot of people, which is ironic because a lot of people tend to blame protein, but almost nobody has digestive issues with protein. I think, in fact, the reason many people prefer carnivore diets, or some people, it's because they essentially go zero FODMAP as a result of that. And then you find that even without any fiber in the diet, their digestion is actually still okay. I do think protein can exacerbate the problems of other foods. Like if you eat a lot of beans and a lot of protein, that amplifies the gasiness. So it's no bueno. But for most people, it's a matter of finding which foods, and you can use like, I don't think I've published an article on this. So you can use like Monash University. They have FODMAP charts and see what's like high FODMAP, what's the most likely culprit. Exclude that, see what it does. And you have to be very systematic. because this is something that if you're just going to try stuff all the time and every day you eat something different, it's going to be absolutely impossible to tell which food is the culprit. And I've seen that so many times in people where they're actually convinced it's like, I can tolerate this, but they never have enough consistency in their diet to actually rigorously test this. And as a result, they go months or years going through their life thinking, oh, I definitely can't eat bread. And then it turns out bread is actually not the problem at all. It's the beans they had, for example. And in research terms, researchers talk about an elimination diet and oral food challenges, which basically just means you can either cut everything out, that would be an elimination diet, or you cut out at least one food, and then sort of build up from there, and then introduce one food at a time. That would be an oral food challenge. That's sort of the structured, systematic way to do it. But if you're only looking at foods that are big culprits, you can also do it one food at a time. So just have the same diet that you normally eat, and then you think, well, the beans, those are definitely a likely culprit. I exclude the beans, see what happens for a week. No change? Okay, it's probably not the beans. I might be lactose intolerant. Okay, cut out the dairy. Wait another week, see what happens.
Yeah. Okay. Awesome. So that makes a lot of sense. So most times it's just FODMAPs, yeah. I think that Stan Efferding kind of created the vertical diet because of that, and it's like all low FODMAP foods. Okay, that's definitely helpful. I know artificial sweeteners are also included in that, and I think for guys in prep too. I think that's
sugar alcohols specifically.
Yeah.
There's a big difference there between like sucralose or aspartame. Most people don't have issues with that. The vast majority of people, I would say, don't have issues with sucralose or aspartame.
I've noticed that
sugar alcohols are really bad for a lot of people.
So like erythritol.
Yeah. Almost all protein bars.
Is stevia included in that?
No, stevia is generally well tolerated, along with like sucralose and aspartame. Like the most popular ones that don't have any calories are generally well tolerated.
Okay. Awesome. So I kind of wanted to go over then, I guess, so you've talked about in the past how you have trained both natural and enhanced athletes. I want to ask about, I guess, the differences between like bulking for those individuals, because I know that you have talked about in the past, I've listened to a lot of your work about how you say that for steroid users, it's kind of like you just kind of increase the calories and like nothing happens to their caliper measurement. They might even go down. So and I know that so my philosophy with bulking is you kind of want to find that sweet spot. And this is very genetically determined, I've found as well. Like I have one friend who he's like not really a beginner, but he was gaining about a pound per week. And the difference is like for 16 weeks, like consistently. And there wasn't like any noticeable fat gain. He just looked like he got bigger, like no drugs. And I have some clients who it's like you have to get really slow or else it's going to spill over. My whole philosophy is kind of find that sweet spot of energy surplus that you can tolerate relative to how much fat spillover, and kind of like trying to minimize that. So my question is, when your practical experience, how do the recommendations for weight gain change if you are on steroids or if you are natural?
Yeah, it's the same principle. I'm also a big fan of finding sort of that sweet spot, because most research indicates, at least in natural trainees, that when you cross the level, or as soon as you start gaining any fat, it very quickly turns into all fat. Any excess energy surplus beyond that point is almost exclusively fat. In a few studies, exclusively fat. So you can be in, say, 5% surplus and lean gain, and you can be in 15% surplus and you barely gain any more muscle than the 5% surplus group, but you gain a lot more fat. And there have been at least 2 studies by the GARFA group, one study on high-level sprinters, and I think 1 or 2 more studies where they have findings that are all similar to this. The main difference is that in steroid users, it's the same principle, or androgenic anabolic steroid users, to be correct.
Yeah.
It's that sweet spot is just a lot higher. And I think you also see a difference in the ratio. Like in natural trainees, it's just like, okay, at this point, it's almost all fat. And with steroid users, just like, for one of the sweet spots here. And then you still have a big point where it's like, it's still like, a lot of muscle growth, but a little bit of fat as well. So you just have a lot more leeway. You just need to be a lot more aggressive. That's the other thing. I think on performance enhancing drugs, everything becomes more aggressive. Peak week, way more aggressive. Bulking, way more aggressive. Big shifts between cutting and bulking, energy intakes. Training volumes are higher. Everything is just amplified, basically. And if you don't do that, you're not taking maximal advantage of the steroids. So it's the same principles that apply, just on an amplified scale.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So it's still like the same things for beginner, intermediate, advanced, but maybe just experiment with yourself if you are taking, it applies to like everybody, like especially if you are taking, like how much weight gain can you get away per week before you start spilling over, then pull back and you can kind of see where you're at. So that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
How would you also? Sorry, go ahead.
For a natural, it's also even more amplified because for a natural, you generally, or at least most people, I think, for especially women, prefer to stay on the side of staying lean, especially when you sort of tasted being truly lean. It's quite addictive, and you don't want to lose that. And it's like if you're in any energy surplus, what do we have to gain from becoming more aggressive? Not much. So I generally err on the side of staying relatively safe. But if someone's on cycle, you want to make the most of that. So there's extra reason to be like, okay, we're going to make the most of this cycle, just put on as much muscle as possible. And afterwards, if we have excess fat gain, we'll get rid of that. We don't need drugs to get you lean. In fact, I think androgenic anabolic steroids have very little use for cutting, like surprisingly little use. They don't even aid that much, I feel, in muscle retention. Of course, they do help you keep your above natty max. But from what I've seen in the experience I have with people on gear, it's very little effect when cutting and a whole lot of effect when bulking.
Sweet. That makes a lot of sense. So I guess then moving on, I know that there's been some talk about Ponser's constrained energy expenditure model. You did make a post about it. So for those listeners who are unfamiliar with it, basically Herman Ponser is a researcher who has been looking into, I believe it's just energy expenditure and metabolism. And he was basically kind of came to the conclusion that there seems to be this sort of, what you call it, an inverted U shape, where you kind of, for more physical activity, like the traditional model is like more physical activity, more energy expenditure. And Herman basically has said that there are some other physiological mechanisms that are down-regulated when you do have a certain level of physical activity. So I wanted to talk to you about, I guess, one, your opinion on kind of that, because I've seen multiple takes. I've heard Greg Nuckols and Eric Trexler roast it. I've heard the Barbell Medicine guys really, really like it. I interviewed Jordan Feigenbaum. He said that he agrees with it. I don't know that from some things I have heard from you have seen that there is some, for example, like when you were cutting that, you have observed it. And I anecdotally even I've experimented with like extreme levels of activity and have these kind of seen like, oh, it seems like there's not much above a certain energy expenditure that I really get. But I guess I want to like hear your take on those findings and then practical application to individuals in their daily lives, because I think that we are becoming more and more aware of the role of NEATs. And I think that's great, but I think that with obsessive bodybuilders and physique enthusiasts, it can be taken too far. So if you should hear elaborate on that, that'd be awesome.
Yeah, the constrained energy expenditure model by Ponser and many others, I think now has enough support to consider it fully legit. The only issue is how much and when is there constrained energy expenditure. We have a lot of data now, from especially in animals, but also lots in humans now. Cross-sectional analyses within subject analyses, like the Ponser study was at least very big. I don't think it was the best study on this. It was one of the more popular ones, but we have had many studies before showing that increases in physical activity don't translate into greater fat loss, and in at least one study also not into greater energy expenditure, which very directly supports a constrained energy expenditure module. So essentially, the idea is that if you are more physically active, you expend more energy up to a point, and there are diminishing returns. So if you add, say, 2 hours of cardio a week, maybe you get net 2 hours extra energy expenditure. So you burn 600 extra, maybe that 600 is all added to your weekly total energy expenditure. But when you go up to 3, 4, for example, then each additional hour becomes maybe 80%, 60% of what you actually get, because the other 20% is offset by reductions in other energy expenditure. And there is some debate about what it is that's down regulated then, and I think it's neat. And there has been a review, I think relatively recently, a few months ago, where they also argue it's neat. Sponsor argues it's BMR. There's very few data showing BMR decreases, and it would also be theoretically unlikely, because BMR is kind of essential. If you're in a coma, you still have your BMR, which goes to show, that's vital processes operating. It's not something the body can just be like, oh, the liver, let's shut that down for a bit. We did too much cardio today. Kidneys, you can do without those. I heard you can do with, 1. Let's do with 0. So I don't think that makes a lot of sense. Neat makes a lot of sense because it's actually the same mechanism at play that occurs when you're dieting. We know that when you get to a certain level of leanness, your metabolism, or always when you're cutting and you're losing body fat, your metabolism decreases faster, your energy expenditure goes down faster than you would expect based on just the weight loss and the decrease in energy intake. That's called adaptive thermogenesis. And I think actually the mechanism for adaptive thermogenesis and constrained energy expenditure might well be the same mechanism at play. If you think about it, it's also something that occurs more long-term, and it has similar evolutionary purposes to prevent excess energy deficits, either from activity or from lack of food intake. So I think it's probably going to be similar, and we do see trends that the effect is greater when you have greater levels of physical activity. So, like I said, if you're not doing any exercise and you're worried about constrained energy expenditure to go to the gym 3 times a week, don't be. In fact, the few studies we have on resistance training show 0 constrained energy expenditure for strength training. It's only for cardio and specifically for lower intensity exercise or just physical activity. So I think for most people, it's probably the main issue where, or the main scenarios where it would be practically relevant is for cardio, especially list cardio, and high levels of physical activity, such as forcing a high step count. And for those, it basically shows the returns you'll get from that are smaller than you might calculate. And I think theoretically, almost every contest prep coach will tell you that's true. That cardio does not do as much as you think. If you do the math, you think, okay, your energy expenditure should be like 500 higher from this cardio. You're not in 500 calories greater energy deficit. Like that would be a big effect. And you already alluded that I see it in myself. At a certain level of leanness, when I add like half an hour cardio a day, every day, nothing happens. I do 30 minutes of cardio a day or none, 0 difference for me. I have a crazy adaptive metabolism, but that's something that actually took me quite a bit of time to fully comprehend, because it's something that I can see in myself really readily. I do the cardio, it doesn't result in any fat loss. I see it in my calipers, my measurements, nothing happens. I cut my calories by just 100, and I start gradually losing fat again. So there is definitely something there, but I think for a lot of people, it's mainly cardio and high step counts where you might start seeing it.
Yeah, so we basically so say the whole overall thing is that for most people, it's probably not a concern. And the main thing is just finding a level of physical activity that doesn't stress you out and is like suitable for your lifestyle. Then
yeah, and generally more physical activity is good, but if you're forcing like 10K steps on top of high training volume and maybe also doing cardio, yeah, you're going to get very strong diminishing returns. And contest prep cardio is somewhere where a lot of contest prep coaches see it, I think. And you very commonly see traditional contest prep coaches recommend an hour, sometimes 2 hours of cardio, especially many bikini competitors and stuff. You see them on crazy protocols, and then the coaches go like, she's doing 2 hours of cardio, an hour of strength training, she's barely losing fat or not losing fat. Like, what's going on? Well, that's, I think, definitely constrained energy expenditure coupled with excessive stress and recovery.
Yeah, no, I was actually just going to say that because I was saying that I think that something that people forget is that that's stress on your body. You're already in a big stress when you're that lean, and adding on
Yes.
more activity could just really just make that just snowball and blah blah blah. And like, oh, that's why lots of times like, oh, we pulled back a little bit, and then whoosh, like they just start losing, like all that cortisol induced water
Mm-hmm.
retention. Um, so yeah, in practical applications, I generally just give my clients a minimum that I say, hey, this is probably smart. If they're dramatically below that, which some clients are, I try to slowly increase it like 1,000 steps per week, and then kind of get
Mm-hmm.
them up to that minimum that I want them at. Because I do think that if I'm correct me if I'm wrong, but there's some really good data just about general health outcomes and then potential better nutrient partitioning if you do have a certain level of step count. I believe that I remember Dr. Mike has shared some figures. I believe it's up to 15,000 steps, and then it kind of has the cutoff above that is like not much.
Yeah. For health, definitely. In fact, even when you're already exercising. However, when you're already, for example, me, if I'm training every day already for about an hour, the additional effect of also having a high step count is mostly by avoiding being sedentary. So probably if I make sure that I get up every 15 minutes to do something, I don't stay seated for too long, I'm going to get 80 to 90% of that effect. And whether I then take 15,000 steps, which most people need to do to be that active, but if I would artificially just get up every 15 minutes, do 2 side twists and sit back down, I think you'll get like 80, 90% of that effect. Because if you look at the effect of added physical activity on health outcomes, a study, I think 1 or 2 years ago, looked at reasonably active elderly individuals, and they added 2 cardio sessions a week, and it did nothing anymore. Like no effect on all-cause mortality, or at least not on overall all-cause mortality, at least. And in general, research finds that especially for endurance training, which cardio essentially is, there are very strong diminishing returns. Like I think 2 to 4 hours. Most health organizations actually caution against doing much more than that. So with step count, it's not as much of an issue probably, because there's very little potential for harm. But I think it is good to realize for people that are like obsessed with being optimally healthy, you're going to be especially when you're lean and you're already training most days a week or even every day of the week, you're going to be very healthy. There's like not much extra effect that you're probably going to get. So I think it's not a big consideration, but it's definitely one of those things where might have some extra health benefit if it also helps you burn some more calories. Then if you can implement that and it's sustainable, etc., it's all good.
Also, yeah, it makes a lot of good sense. I think there's a lot of practical applications there. So I kind of want to ask now this, because like you know a lot about genetics, like you've done a lot of research on it. I guess what does having good genetics for weight training like actually mean? Because I think people throw that around. They're like, good genetics, bad genetics. And then how do you know if you have good genetics, and does that change anything in terms of how you do things versus if you have quote unquote a poor training response?
Yeah, it's actually very difficult to define that, because we have loads of genes and they interact with each other. And then there's epigenetics, and then there's the interaction between genes and nutrition, for example. So most genetic analyses cannot predict very well whether someone actually has good genes. So if you do like 23andMe or something, I think that's most popular now. Even if you do a full genome analysis and you would ask them like, how good is this person's genetics? As in, how much muscle do you expect they will build in say 6 months of strength training compared to someone else? It's going to be very, very rudimentary in terms of estimates. Like we have ACE gene and there's one more that has reasonable explanatory power. I think ACE is probably top currently, but still that's like a few percent of explanatory variance. So mostly when we say good genes, it's more that we observe that they're getting training adaptations really fast, and it's very it's a very abstract thing when we talk about good genetics. So we're basically just saying, well, we've observed that they gain muscle very easily, and in practice, that's all that matters. Some people gain it much faster, some people gain it slower, and we're basically just scratching the surface of, for example, one thing that still majorly surprises me, but is very consistent in research, is that baseline fat-free mass or muscle mass, lean body mass, does not predict how much muscle mass you build when you start training. And I think this runs counter to almost everyone's intuitions, where you say like, yeah, that guy's always been big. Like Arnold Schwarzenegger, you see pictures of when he was 15, and it's like, yeah, he already has crazy biceps. Good pecs, 15 years old. Of course, he's going to get huge pecs, huge biceps later on. But research very consistently finds there is no correlation, and that's pretty crazy, because it just runs so counter to most people's observations. There's also the question of, does the rate of gain correlate with total natty max? For example, I have one client who has really poor genetics, Asian guy. It's all the check marks for being hard gainer. We've been working with him for 5 years or so now, and he's still gaining, like super slowly, but still gaining. So basically 5 years ago, or like after the first year we've been training together, I was like, I think we're going to hit end of the road pretty soon here, because things are just so slow. But 5 years later, still every cut and bulk cycle we see is a few pounds heavier, or one pound heavier at same caliper levels. So still not at his natty max. He's still gaining. So in some individuals, at least, it seems that slow gaining does not necessarily mean also lower muscular potential, which is interesting, because I think a lot of people do assume that those two correlate.
Yeah, I also think that there's a lot of things we said just about effort when people say, "Oh, I have bad genetics" or whatnot. Because for myself, like, I have quote unquote good genetics, but ever since I started lifting, I hired a coach. Literally from day one, because I said, I'm going to do this thing. I'm very extremist. I'm like all or nothing. I train for 15 hours a week. I get 8 hours of sleep minimum per night. I cross my T's, dot all my I's, and that's why I am consistently 8 to 12% body fat, even when I'm gaining and whatnot. And I did have a very fast response in terms of strength in particular. And you could even say I had bad genetics because I was anorexic. I was anorexic when I started out, and now I'm gained 50 pounds in 5 years. And that's something I have noticed just as a coach. People who will come to me saying, I don't think I have good genetics, and they'll say that, and I'm like, how about we don't even consider that, and how about you just try your absolute hardest, and then we see what happens. Because I do think that lots of times people do pigeonhole themselves into, I wish I was 200 pounds and deadlifting 800 pounds at 10% body fat by yesterday. But I think that sometimes having unrealistic expectations and not really understanding, like, everybody has, like you said, everybody grows at different rates and whatnot. Like, how about you just actually try and you're consistent, and then you don't pigeonhole yourself, and then you make changes as needed. Right. Because I've seen it all the times. Like, I go to, like, with powerlifting gym that I go to, we have like world record holders. We have top level powerlifters in that gym. And I've seen time and time again, everybody, like, I go to a commercial gym too. And I've seen these same people for 2 years. They don't look any different. Like, they've been, because quote unquote trying, but then for some reason I go to this powerlifting gym, and everybody's just getting more jacked, more strong, like consistently, like every single month there's changes, even if they are small. But especially like people that do join the gym, and then I see them like 2 months later, I'm like, you're way more jacked now. So I think there's also something to be said about environments, and kind of self-talk with, I guess, your overall training response. Because I don't know if you're familiar with John Kiley, but I know that he's basically he critiques periodization and some of like the tenets of it, and basically saying like there's like no rules for it, kind of like Mike Teixeira-esque with like periodization. but like and I found this too with my athletes, is that your mindset going into training and around it, like it does affect the training response. I think biopsychosocial model has a lot to do with that. But yeah, it's just I think that's one of my biggest gripes, because all I say is like, look, like, you don't, unless you want to be a professional athlete, I don't think it matters that much. Two, like, if you don't like it, then you can just train at maintenance volumes after 3 years of hard training, and then be happy with where you're at. So yeah, I guess I don't particularly think it matters whether or not you have good genetics. I think that what mostly matters is, do you try hard, or do you enjoy lifting? Because if you enjoy lifting and you actually try hard, I mean, you're probably going to lift for life. And if you're only doing this for the outcome goal, I know that you have a book about, like, that you just put out, that talks about this. But if you only have an outcome goal, you don't really like the process, like, you're just not going to last. Like,
Definitely.
so yeah, that's something like you noticed too with like some of your lifters, or yourself anecdotally.
Absolutely. Motivation and effort are more important than genetics in the vast majority of people. And it's also good to realize that in research that we have, that pigeonholes some people as hard gainers or non-responders, as research might say, it doesn't actually show that they can't gain muscle. It just shows that while attempting this specific program, they did not gain muscle. That might have been due to effort. It might have been due to insufficient protein intake. It might have been because this volume is too high or too low. It could be for numerous reasons that do not necessarily mean this person just can't gain muscle by strength training. So that's very, very different way of looking at it, especially since we have research now that very conclusively shows some people actually need higher volumes and other people need lower volumes to make good gains. And especially beyond a certain level of advancement, a lot of people get into the level where you need to do stuff right, a lot of things right, to gain any more muscle or strength. Like just basically going to the gym, training hard, getting your protein in. At some point that stops working for most people. And at that point, it may appear like, oh, you have bad genetics, but it may just mean that you need to try things differently, or you just need to be a bit smarter and optimize a few more things. And that might be the difference between gaining and not gaining.
Yeah, 100%. I could not agree more, because I remember during COVID, when the gyms shut down, I still did have access to a gym, but I got really lazy with my diet. I didn't really train super hard. I was intentionally skipping my squat, bench, and deadlift, because I was like, don't really feel like it, and like I lost gains. I got way weaker. I chop it off, like I even like re-injured myself, injured my lat, and I was out for like 2 months. And then I was like, well, powerlifting meet. Then like in this past year, it's been the most productive year of training, because I've tried my absolute hardest, and I've been the most intentional with my training and diet, and that's kind of been the big game changer. So I really like what you just said about motivation, and effort just matters more than whether or not you have the good genes. So we come up on the hour, so I want to just thank you so much for being able to come on here. I think that you went over lots of really good things. I guess, where can people find you? Anything you would like them to know? Any cool future plans? So
my pleasure. Anything you want to find out about me is on mennohenselmans.com. Best way to get to know me, probably, if you don't know yet, is my free email course. You get lots of free content, my most popular articles, a lot of stuff like that. And you'll said I'm on Instagram and Facebook. I post a lot of new study reviews and stuff there. So that's something else to check out if you're into evidence-based, getting jacked and strong.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Menno. Guys, please make sure to follow him on there. If you guys do want to stay up to date with everything, and definitely somebody to follow and pay attention to what he says. So thank you again for coming on, Menno, and I'll talk to you guys in the next podcast.